Time for sound design. In this video, I'm going to talk about how to use samples but still create a beat that is clean and crisp and doesn't sound like you took something from an old record. Sampling is often associated with 90s boombap hip-hop, and it's often associated with dusty loops and vinyl crackle and getting really kind of dirty beats and tracks when you use samples. But of course it doesn't have to be like that. And in this video I'll show you a track I made in Ableton using several samples, 7 in total, from 7 different tracks, and how I went about finding the samples, selecting it, and how I composed it into a beat. And the kind of samples I use from these records is mostly one-shot drum hits like hi-hats or snares, and also single notes that I then create into a melody of my own. So in this video I will go layer by layer in Ableton to show you the original and then how I use this sample and what kind of effects and sound design I did to it. But before we get to the first sample, let me first play the result of the track I made. So as you can hear, it's for now just a 4-bar loop with a 2-bar variation at the end and a 1-bar intro. And it has all the different elements that you would expect. So there's a bass line, drums, there's a kick, snare, hi-hat, some effect sounds, a vocal sample, and some kind of pad sound. The only, in total there are 7 samples. The only 2 things that is not a sample is the kick drum and a ride sample, like a percussion sample. So the first sample is from the Dutch band Urban Dance Squad. The track's called Kenny Strip Experience, and it is at the beginning of the track there's some open drums and also a bass note. So it's the bass note that I use. The track starts like this. And it's that bass note that I used, and that's the first track of this beat. So it's a bit off, so I detuned it a little bit, -18, and then I just used the B, and then later I tuned it to a G and a C. I made it mono, and then in the intro I did some repeating of the note. And that's basically how I created the bass line for this beat. So I sampled a single bass guitar note from an open note at the beginning of a track. By sampling a single note, you can really play the kind of melody that you want. So that's a good approach when you want clean samples. All right, continuing. I layered this with a kick drum. The kick drum is from Ableton, so it's not a sample. And then on the second sample that I used is from Ice-T, Fried Chicken, from the original Gangster album, and it's the snare together with some kind of other melodic element, and the track sounds like this. So it's really this first hit that I used. So that is here. Together with the kick and the bass, it sounds like this. It's very simple. I just did a low cut EQ of 100 Hertz. And then for the second part, where I tuned the kick up and I tuned the snare from Ice-T's track 2 octaves down. And I also put the rapping mode on texture, and I lowered the volume and I did a more aggressive low cut of 300 Hertz. So here it sounds like this. So just that little of sound design and the pitching down really transforms this very clear and crisp snare into something that's more like a noise burst. So I'll go from this sound. Then I added some extra snares here on an extra track. So at the end of the 4th bar you have a few double snares. So that's the second sample. So the third sample is from Malcolm McLaren's Would You Like More Scratching? And I used the hi-hats from the opening beat. This beat is also sampled by Janet Jackson, I believe. So it's really these, one of the hi-hats here. And then for the hi-hats, I put it on 2 tracks, and basically the only difference here is in volume. So there's a accented and then a regular hi-hat, I guess you can call it. So it sounds like this every 8th note. And then on the group there's an auto pan. So that's how you get the effect that the hi-hat moves a little bit in stereo field from left to right. And again, it's like using very short samples that are basically one-shots and that you can cleanly cut out of the original. That really helps to create something that is original and doesn't sound like a dusty loop from a record. So far we have a bass, the kick is from Ableton, a snare and a hi-hat, and it sounds like this. So this is all very basic, so let's move on to sample number 4, and that is from the Wild Style original soundtrack, Grandmaster Caz, South Bronx Subway Rap, and it starts with some kind of vocal intro. So I took the first part, the ya, and then without any effects it sounds like this. And then with some low cut EQ and delay. And then repeat that twice in 4 bars. The next sample, that is sample number 5, is from Stanley Clarke and George Duke, Touch and Go. And here let me play the original first. And this one is a bit more tricky because when you hear it, then you can totally see that this is a loop that you can just use and put some drums underneath it. But I didn't want to do that. So I just took one note out of this sequence. I think it is the 3rd note, and that sounds actually clean enough. So the way I used it is like this. So if you zoom out in the sample, you see it is sort of the 3rd or the 4th note. I put a low cut EQ of 200 and some reverb on it, and then later I do a little bit of repeating, and that's basically it. Then sample number 6 is from the original soundtrack from Jurassic Park from 1993, and it's the end credit, so it's the last song on the soundtrack, and then it's also the end of the song. And here I was looking for something that is kind of continuous, so I kind of can create a pad sound from it, and I used sampler. So I'll first play you the original. Like movie soundtracks are really good for this type of sample because you often have these kind of tracks where there's only a couple of instruments, melodic instrument, there's no drums, so you can really easily and cleanly sample from here. And what I did is I put this sample into sampler, as you can see here, and I took the last part and I looped it. So without any effects, if I just play the original pitch, it sounds like this, and it's pretty long, but then I looped it as well, so you can basically hold this note and you have kind of a background kind of pad sound that you can use. And that's exactly what I did here. You see it's just a D that goes on for 2 bars. Then I put some effects on it, a bit of saturation and drive, low cut EQ and an auto pan to create some kind of movement, because it's a quite static sound. And of course what is important is to look at the tuning. So everything is in the key of C major, so this is a D. The Stanley sample was also a D, so you have to make sure that it kind of fits together all the different samples, and that can sometimes be the tricky thing with using that many different samples from different records that were written in different keys. So now together with the other melodic elements, let's put it together with the bass and the other sample. So that sounds pretty good together. Then going for the last sample, and this is from a 70s Japanese record. And again, here I challenged myself a little bit by using a tiny sound that doesn't seem to be something you can sample very clean, but it turns out you can. So this is the original. So the track's called First Light. And it's really the beginning of the track, the first note actually, that I used. So how did I do this? It's in the break, so the part 2 of the track. And as you can see, I used really the first part, the first note, without any effects. It sounds like this. So it's very short. I put a little fade in the end as well, so that you don't hear the next note coming in. I tuned it to a whole note. I think this is a G. And then I put in a low cut EQ, some delay and an auto pan in it to create a bit more out of this very short note. So basically, this is a trick I often do to put a delay on something that's very small to kind of extend it without having to loop it. And then you get this. And then together with the pad sound. So these were all the samples that I have used. The only thing left is the right sample, the percussion for the intro. That's just a standard stock sound from Ableton. At the end of this video, I'll play this track for a bit of longer time so you can listen to it and kind of see if you can hear all the different elements that I just discussed. But basically, this is the approach that if I want to sample something, but not necessarily make it sound like it has been sampled, or I want to make a track that is a bit more clean, then I go for individual percussion hits like a hi-hat, a snare. That is usually, you can find it at the beginning of a track or at the end of a track. And I go for melodic notes, so one open bass note or one kind of open vocal or from an a cappella or an intro. And in that way you can kind of put together something that contains a lot of different samples, but it still sounds like this could have been made by using actual instruments instead of sampling from records. And it's just a fun challenge to actually find these open sounds and be creative with them. And sometimes when you listen to something, you don't think there's anything you can take out of it. But then when you put it into Ableton or whatever the software is or the hardware that you use, and you kind of zoom into the sample and you isolate it, then you can get away with things that you might not think before you actually put it in. So it's always worth it to sample it and try it, because sometimes it works. And a good example is the last one, the Japanese sample that I used, the tiny note at the beginning. You think it's too short, but then if you actually try it and you put some delay on it, then it can actually be a little sound. Of course, it's not enough to carry the entire track, but as in one of the sounds that you put in this collage, it can actually work. All right, that was it for today. I hope you find this inspiring. I will play the entire beat for a bit longer at the end of this video, so stay tuned for that. As always, thanks for watching, keep making music, and see you in the next one.